trace the journey of an artist. A life rendered from a palette of fire, snow, the magic of dance. He knew of love, expression, comfort in the winter years. The memories are mine. The story is his. He was Frederick to some, to others simply Freddie. As for me, he was the man I knew as Uncle Fred. At times subtle, oftentimes stark, landmarks linger in our midst. They recall experiences. They remind us of lives past. The Melbourne Road near the town of Richmond, Quebec. Following the St. Francis River, it's as if it runs through a mountain of memories, past the places that retell the life of Frederick Coburn.
We would come down frequently on weekends to visit him. He was in his 80s then. I remember one time in particular, and I was very young, I was maybe 4 years old. Everybody got out of the car, Uncle Fred came out to greet us, and they all sort of took off across here, which was not a lawn then, it was a hayfield. And I remember sort of somehow straggling behind and getting sort of halfway out and feeling that I was lost in this hay. I suddenly realized it was over my head, and I didn't quite know where everybody was. And then all of a sudden, when I was getting really sort of panicky, this hand sort of came down through the hay, and I remember it being mottled. He was very old then, his hand was mottled with age, and Uncle Fred sort of put his hand down and kind of guided me through the hay to join the others. And I guess I've always sort of had the feeling that, in a way, that hand is still guiding me through the wildflowers.
The son of a postmaster, Fred was born in 1871 in the tiny community of Melbourne, here in the Eastern Townships.
The land for this church was donated by Fred's maternal grandfather. And this is where the family came. I mean, he and his family and all the local families from the area, the Scottish Presbyterians, would come to this church. And Fred used to come up here as a child, and he would sketch in his hymn book the heads of people, the backs of people's heads, a little girl with braids, people's profiles. He was particularly interested, from what I understand, in the ladies' hats. He would find whatever subject caught his fancy. He was just coming out of church one day, as the story goes, and there was a horse in the field, and he was standing there sketching the horse. And along came the local bank manager, whose name was Mr. Ball, and he said, can I see your sketch? So Fred showed him the sketch, and Mr. Ball, I guess, was impressed enough that he asked Fred to do one for him of his own horse. And Fred was 10 years old at the time, as the story goes. And he sketched this horse for Mr. Ball and handed him the sketch. And Mr. Ball was so delighted, he gave Fred a $10 bill for this sketch. And $10, this was in 1881, $10 was an extraordinary amount of money for something like that.
At 16, Fred enrolled under C.S. Stevenson at the Montreal Council of Art School, where a mix of studies and freelance illustration set a pattern. 1889, it was New York for the young artist, mentoring under the renowned Carl Hecker. Soon Coburn headed to Europe. Berlin inspired precision, London the charm of drawing, and in Paris it was Impressionism.
His abilities and his knowledge of art from his studies and work in illustration was very, very strong. The quality of his composition, of his imagery, remained very, very strong throughout his career. His portraits struck me as thoroughly impressive. The Berlin series of charcoal drawings, for instance, are remarkable. Some of the people I saw in his portraits I'd like to meet. They're so alive and so present.
On one of many return trips to Canada, Fred was reintroduced to a subject that would thread through his life. He met the Irish-born poet and doctor, William Henry Drummond. Drummond sought an illustrator for the Habitant, his first of several works of stylized dialect poetry. Coburn would be his choice. With the success of the publication, an enduring friendship began that had at its center a love for the myths and legends of rural Quebec. Of Drummond, Coburn would say, "He gave me my first real confidence in myself." Further illustrations for the renowned Quebec poet Louis Fréchette put Fred on the road to stardom as an artist who illustrated.
Both the poetry that Dr. William Henry Drummond wrote and the illustrations that Coburn executed to illustrate the poetry speak of the sort of elevating the rural to a high status when seen in comparison with the horrors of urban life, especially at that time. Coburn wasn't executing caricatures. There was no mockery, there was no moralizing. They were paintings in themselves, canvases. They were independent works of art, as well as serving a dual purpose, and that is to illustrate the poetry. By the time that Drummond died in 1908, Coburn was well on his way to being a renowned Canadian artist. Coburn ended up by illustrating Washington Irving's works, Dickens, Tennyson's, a lot of it previously illustrated classics. It also led him to do a Life magazine illustration, for instance, a cover illustration. He also ended up by doing Edgar Allan Poe's illustrations.
In order to interpret Poe, he really had to wrestle with demons, and he writes in one of his letters that he finally had to throw away all of his drawings. He just didn't have it, and start again. But in starting again, I think he captured something quite astonishing about Poe. And he was later to say that he felt that his Poe illustrations were among his very best. He really rose pretty high in the world of illustration. He was very highly regarded because he treated it so seriously, and because he put so much into it. He came very close on numerous occasions to burning out. I mean, he would stay up all night and work on illustrations and then go to school all day. And he suffered from eye strain. I mean, he really paid the price for the illustrations.
While studying in Antwerp, Coburn fell in love. The Belgium-born artist Melvina Schiepers was evasive. With war approaching, a dejected Coburn reluctantly headed home, the words of his art teacher Carl Hecker haunting him. "Love your art as dear as your sweetheart, and never part with it." That spring of 1913, Fred left both loves behind. In the early 1900s, here as elsewhere, illustration was replaced by photography. Fred welcomed the change. Having returned to the nearby Eastern Townships, a 25-year career behind him, he renewed his dream to paint. He contacted Morris Cullen, an artist and friend who would influence him.
This is Gagnon?
Yeah, here's a Gagnon. I actually painted in Norway.
I've never seen one that wasn't Quebec.
Yeah, he
At the time, at the turn of the century, there were a number of Quebec artists who were doing spectacular things. Cullen was one, Clarence Gagnon, James Maurice, Suzor Cote. And I see another Cullen. Water for Cullen was like horses for Coburn. I mean, Fred said that he wanted to paint the Canadian scene and the winter scene in particular. So Cullen was his mentor, and he loved Cullen's work. He thought Cullen was the greatest artist in Canada, actually.
Working in Quebec's Beaupré region, Cullen convinced Fred to replace somber European tones with a brighter palette. The world Coburn once shared with Drummond was rendered onto canvases that quickly sold to nostalgic urban audiences. Coupled with this, in 1915, Melvina joined Fred in Canada. With studios in Montreal and Melbourne, they shared a life of art. Coburn had arrived.
All of the years of study that he'd put into his art gave a quality to his work, which made it very easy for the public to fall in love with his work and buy it. And his paintings of the Eastern Township landscapes were, of course, very easily identifiable, the wintry scenes, and I think that hit the public's interest.
The Coburn sky, his trademark, Fred would go on to produce some of the most recognized winter studies in Canadian art history. Yet for all of this, some critics felt the painter was beating his horses to death with a brush.
He was obviously a very determined and committed person, so it's not surprising to me at all to see him repeat the image of the snow scene or the horse. It would be only natural for him to work on it and work on it and work on the light and the composition. The same subject matter again and again. It wouldn't have been purely for entrepreneurial reasons.
Suddenly, on one of the Coburn's many trips to Europe, the music ended. Paris, 1933. After 18 years of marriage and an unexplained illness, Melvina was dead.
He was completely devastated. He went with her body back to Antwerp and gave her back to the family, so to speak, and then he said, "I will never return." And he came back to Canada, and he couldn't bear to even go back. He never went back again.
In recent years, research into Fred's work brought me closer to the uncle I barely knew. I had heard of his love of dance and his connection to a dance studio. I had seen the photos, I had read the letters, but this other woman, subject of many of his canvases, who was she? I needed to find her. Time was on my side. At a little cafe on Guy Street in Montreal, we would meet. Marguerite Lavoie, dancer, model, also known as Carlotta.
Thierry m'a envoyé une carte de Coburn, voyez, avec des chevaux. Et puis, j'ai dit à Thierry, les chevaux dansent. Les chevaux dansent, vous savez, il y a tellement de la vie, de la jeunesse dans ça. Il avait gardé une jeunesse, vous savez, magnifique, Coburn.
Le soleil était beaucoup plus chaud. Plus chaud? Okay.
Retrieving some of the lost years, I now have a sense of the many moments they shared over a span of 2 decades.
Okay.
Au soleil.
Oui, c'est beau, hein? At first, they just sort of met, and she posed a few times, and then he gradually, and this was after months and months, he gradually began to ask her if she might want to go to the ice follies with him or a symphony with him. And, at first, she said no because she thought he was married. Nobody had told her that his wife had died. And so when she first refused, the housekeeper intervened and said, "Well, you know, please go with him." And she said, "But I thought he was married." He said, "No, he needs somebody to bring him out of this depression." Il était juste dans le studio ici en bas.
Oui, oui.
Et il y a eu le studio en avant Ou...
Oui, parce que la lumière du nord,
Ah oui,
la lumière,
ah
vous
oui.
voyez, pour les artistes, c'est très précieux.
The studio on Rue Saint-Mathieu. Within these four walls began the renaissance of Frederick Coburn. Here, in this Montreal flat, the music played again.
J'arrivais et puis on commençait un petit peu à travailler de la peinture. Et puis je m'arrive, disais, bon ben c'est l'heure de manger à présent. Vous voyez, je passais à peu près 2 heures, 2 heures et demie avec lui.
The old theater and studios on St. Catherine Street, once vibrant, now silent.
Pour les grands portraits qu'il a fait de moi, il a loué un studio qui était très grand. Et puis ça lui permettait de faire ses peintures et de faire de la danse. La moitié du temps, c'était de la danse, vous savez, qu'on faisait. Il payait un petit peu et puis il faisait de la danse. Il dansait du tango, de la valse. Coburn aimait tellement la danse, vous voyez. C'est un peu grâce à lui que nous avons ouvert le studio. Nous avons eu notre premier studio quand nous avons ouvert sur la rue Green. Le samedi et le mercredi, c'était des rendez-vous d'artistes, de musiciens, et c'était de la conversation pour la danse, la musique. Nous avons été mêlés beaucoup à des gens, des grands artistes, vous savez. Coburn était très heureux, vous savez, avec nous autres. Il faisait une vie qu'il aimait, vous voyez.
Along the St. Francis River. Here, where Fred's story began, with Carlotta, the days of summer were revisited.
In the art world at the time, apparently, there was gossip about the fact that they were having an affair. And that has never been proven or disproven. But what I find fascinating is that he was in his 60s when he met her, and she was, you know, barely 20. Fred suddenly wanted to relive his youth. He hadn't had, I don't think, a carefree youth. And as he got older, he wanted to really make up for lost time. And suddenly Carlotta comes along, and with her vivacious energy, her exuberance, I think Fred was just magnetized by that.
J'avais appris à conduire, mais j'avais pas de licence. Mais dans les montagnes, il me faisait conduire. Et souvent, quand il voyait un cheval, vous savez, ou un petit coin là qu'il aimait, il faisait un petit sketch. Une bonne journée, nous étions dans les montagnes à Richmond. Et puis, sur la route, il avait quelque chose. Il a arrêté, il a trouvé un petit Kodak, une petite boîte. Il l'a ramassé et c'est avec ça qu'il a fait sa première photographie en mouvement.
With a passion for dance, he would chase images with the eye of a hunter. Coached by photographer George Nakash, this now abandoned slate quarry became an outdoor studio for Fred's newfound medium.
He would come up here with Carlotta, and she would stand up on a hill like this, or a great slab of slate, and she'd do her arabesques in her dance costumes against the sky when there were great clouds, and they would probably picnic up here. It was quite a spectacular sight when you look down and see the water in the bottom, that sort of emerald green, and great huge slabs of slate. I think he started out with quite slowly and with no equipment and very little expertise. And then as he became more and more fascinated by the possibilities of photography, I think he saw it as a vehicle to express his own love of dance, a vehicle to express his love of costumes and fabrics and motion. And the camera allowed him to capture in an instant what it would take him to paint, I mean, the motion would be over by the time he would paint such a thing.
It's been said that we do not remember days. We remember moments. Landmarks. They surround us, often ghost-like in the shadows. A part of our experience, they remain as clues, signposts.
Everything must have happened here because he would have set off from Melbourne, crossed the little bridge, come over here to go to Montreal to do his first art studies. He would have gone back and forth constantly when he was studying in Europe, and then he'd return home every year. When he and Malvina got married, they would constantly come back and forth by train to take the ships from Montreal. This is where Carlotta always came down on the train to meet Fred. They would go in the afternoon for a concert and come back in the evening, and it was a very frequent schedule.
The house along the Melbourne Road. While in his 70s, having given up the Montreal apartment, Uncle Fred came here to live. Here he painted some of his best winter scenes. Here he painted his last.
Il m'a écrit une lettre une fois, et puis c'est là que j'ai compris un peu que Coburn avait beaucoup plus que de l'amitié pour moi, vous savez. Mais je l'ai réalisé trop tard. Je crois qu'on s'aimait et on ne le savait pas.
For me, it is the house of the wildflower recollections. The stuff of my childhood, smells of paint and turpentine, a house alive with photographs and canvases and music. Yes, always the music. Now I see this old house most every day, and I cherish the moments and the memory of the man who lived and danced to the finish.